The Screaming Rain. Chapter 1, Arrival on the Midnight Train. The rain fell like an endless barrage, hammering against the windows of the Black Hollow Express. Outside, the world was a shadowy blur of twisted trees and muddy hills. Inside the train, the passengers sat in eerie silence, their faces lit intermittently by flickering lights overhead. Amelia pressed her forehead against the cold glass, watching the relentless downpour. She was on her way to Black Hollow to meet her estranged father, a man she hadn't seen in over a decade. The train's rattling and creaking had a hypnotic quality, and she was fighting to keep her eyes open when the first scream echoed through the cabin. It wasn't human. It was a sound Amelia felt more than heard, an unearthly wail that vibrated through her bones. She sat bolt upright, her heart pounding. Others in the car stirred uneasily, exchanging nervous glances. The scream came again, louder this time, cutting through the drumming rain. "Did you hear that?" Amelia whispered to the man sitting across from her. The man, a grizzled fisherman with a rain-soaked coat slung over his knees, gave her a grim nod. "Heard it last time I took this train, too. You'd be smart to stay in your seat and keep quiet." "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Something that don't belong here," he muttered, clutching a small leather pouch hanging from his neck. "Don't go looking. You don't want it to see you." Amelia opened her mouth to press him further, but another scream tore through the air, this one closer. The lights flickered violently, plunging the train into darkness for several agonizing seconds. When they came back on, the car seemed emptier. People were gone, vanished without a sound. She looked around, her pulse quickening. Where did they go? The fisherman leaned in close, his breath reeking of salt and decay. "You don't understand. The rain's not just water. It's a door. And when it opens, they come through." "Who comes through?" Amelia demanded, her voice rising. The train shuddered violently, throwing her against the window. The scream came again, impossibly loud, echoing down the corridor. This time, it was joined by another sound, wet, slapping footsteps, like something heavy and slimy dragging itself along the floor. Amelia's stomach turned as a foul stench filled the air. It smelled of rotting fish and stagnant water. She turned toward the source of the noise, her breath hitching. A shadow moved at the far end of the car. It was tall, too tall to be human, with a grotesque, undulating shape. As it stepped closer, the light revealed a body covered in glistening, scale-like skin, its arms elongated and ending in webbed claws. Its head was a bloated, fish-like monstrosity, with lidless, black eyes that reflected the flickering lights. Amelia froze as its gaze locked onto her. Chapter 2, The Thing in the Rain. The creature let out a guttural screech, the sound reverberating through the car. It lunged forward, its movements jerky but horrifyingly fast. Amelia scrambled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. The fisherman grabbed her arm, yanking her into the aisle. "Run," he hissed, dragging her toward the door leading to the next car. The other passengers had already begun to scatter, their panicked screams drowned out by the pounding rain and the creature's unholy wails. The train groaned and lurched as if it were alive, the floor beneath them slick with water that shouldn't have been there. The rain was pouring in, but the windows were still intact. Amelia stumbled after the fisherman, her sneakers slipping on the wet floor. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the creature tearing into a man who had tripped in the aisle. It didn't kill him quickly. The thing's claws sliced into flesh with a wet, tearing sound, and the man's screams rose to an unbearable pitch before abruptly cutting off. She gagged, tears streaming down her face. "What is that thing?" "Not from here," the fisherman panted, throwing open the door to the next car. "It's the rain. It brings them through." Before she could respond, the creature slammed into the door behind them, its claws scraping against the metal. The fisherman pulled her forward, into a car that was eerily quiet. The passengers here sat perfectly still, their heads bowed as if in prayer. "What are they doing?" Amelia whispered, her voice hoarse. "Keeping it away," the fisherman said grimly, motioning for her to stay close. "If you're quiet enough, if you don't move, sometimes it'll pass you by." Amelia glanced back as the door behind them buckled. She could see the creature's eyes glinting through the glass, black and void-like, filled with malice. And then, she noticed something else. There wasn't just one. Through the rain-slick windows, she saw more shadows moving outside the train. Their forms were distorted by the downpour, but she could make out their grotesque, aquatic shapes. One of them pressed its face against the window, its jagged teeth scraping against the glass. The train jolted again, and the lights flickered once more. When they came back on, the passengers who had been sitting quietly were gone. Their seats were empty, their belongings left behind as if they had simply vanished into thin air. The fisherman swore under his breath, gripping the pouch around his neck. "We've got to keep moving. They're everywhere now. What do they want?" Amelia asked, her voice shaking as she followed him down the aisle. The fisherman didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "They're looking for something. Or someone. And if they think it's you." The door behind them exploded inward, and the creature barreled into the car, its claws carving deep gouges into the walls. Amelia screamed, grabbing the fisherman's arm as they bolted toward the far door. The thing let out a shriek that rattled her skull, its footsteps slamming against the wet floor as it gave chase. The Swamp Screams. Chapter 1, The Arrival. The Everglades were suffocating. The air was thick, the sky bruised with dark clouds, and the distant hum of cicadas felt like an ominous chant. Dr. Eleanor Riggs tightened her raincoat against the rising wind. She and her team had come to investigate a series of bizarre phenomena, unexplained animal deaths, eerie sounds, and rainfall that carried traces of organic matter unlike anything they'd seen before. "Do you hear that?" muttered Carlos, the team's photographer, as they trudged deeper into the swamp. Eleanor paused. The usual symphony of swamp noises, the croak of frogs, the chirp of crickets, was absent. Instead, there was an eerie silence, broken only by faint, guttural murmurs. It wasn't wind. It wasn't water. It sounded like voices. "Just the wind," she lied, pushing forward. As they set up camp near a cluster of cypress trees, the rain began. It was heavy and relentless, drumming against the tarp above their heads. But the rain wasn't just water. Eleanor frowned as droplets splashed onto her skin, leaving a sticky residue that smelled faintly of decay. Chapter 2, Voices in the Dark. By nightfall, the murmurs grew louder, interspersed with faint, human-like screams. It was as if the swamp was alive, its sounds crawling under their skin. "I'm telling you, someone's out there," said Maya, the team's hydrologist, clutching a flashlight. Her usually confident demeanor was cracking. Eleanor hesitated. "Stay in pairs. We'll check the perimeter." She and Carlos ventured out, their boots sinking into the wet, spongy ground. The beam of their flashlights flickered over twisted roots and stagnant pools. Then they saw it. A figure stood knee-deep in the water, its back to them. Its body was wrong, its arms elongated, its spine hunched unnaturally. Eleanor called out, her voice trembling. "Hey! Are you okay?" The figure turned. Its face was a grotesque mask of rotting plant matter, its eyes hollow and glowing faintly green. It let out a piercing scream that echoed across the swamp, its sound raw and otherworldly. Carlos screamed, dropping his flashlight. The figure lunged toward them, moving with inhuman speed. Eleanor grabbed Carlos and ran, the sound of wet, slapping footsteps close behind. Chapter 3, The Hungry Swamp. Back at camp, chaos erupted. More figures emerged from the darkness, twisted shapes that seemed to grow from the swamp itself. One was